A normal child's day once began without an adult agenda. That's the version most people remember. A child wakes, eats, wanders, comes home. Simple. A little rough, maybe, but fine. Children were resilient, families were closer, communities looked out for their own. It's a comforting picture. And like most comforting pictures, it's incomplete. Start with the morning, not a symbolic one, a real one. The child wakes early, not for school, because the house is already loud. Work has begun. Fire needs feeding. Animals need moving. The day is already in motion. It doesn't wait for small bodies. No one asks how the child slept. Sleep isn't a topic yet. There's no language for it. Breakfast exists, loosely. Food appears. It's eaten, not planned, not timed. Hunger is familiar. Common enough that it rarely gets mentioned. Not a crisis, just background noise. By mid-morning, the child is outside. This is often called freedom, and technically it was. No schedule, no supervision, no check-ins, also no warnings, no guidance on what to avoid. Roads are busy, water is open, tools sit where they were left. Animals behave like animals. Illness moves quietly, unseen, unannounced. The child hasn't been warned, not because no one cared, but because there was nothing to warn them with. Risk isn't a category yet, not one assigned to childhood. Here's the question that usually gets skipped. If everyone knew children were vulnerable, why was so little built to protect them? The answer isn't neglect, not the obvious kind. It's quieter than that. Childhood hadn't been separated out as something protected. Children weren't fragile versions of future adults. They were present participants in a working system. Safety didn't come from prevention. It came from endurance. By afternoon, the child becomes useful. Tasks appear. Naturally. Carry this. Watch that. Fetch something. It isn't framed as responsibility. It's just proximity to work. Learning happens by accident, like dust settling on clothes. No one calls it development. It just builds, slowly. In the evening, the child returns. If they return injured, the assessment is brief. Can they function tomorrow? Pain is real, but it doesn't stop the structure around it. Survival rarely pauses to ask why something happened. From the outside, this day looks ordinary. From the inside, it's something else. Because what feels normal here isn't safety. It's adaptation, and that difference will matter later. The contradiction shows up in what's missing from that day. Not violence, not hardship. Those are easy to spot. What's missing is alarm. Nothing in the routine suggests something is wrong. Adults don't speak like they're taking risks. They aren't weighing trade-offs. They aren't choosing danger over care. They're just repeating patterns. Patterns that work well enough to keep going. This is where modern intuition slips. We assume danger has to be noticed before it's accepted. But danger often disappears because it's constant. If a child gets sick, it's the weather, or their constitution, or fate. If a child gets hurt, it's clumsiness. If a child dies, it's misfortune. These explanations aren't evasions. They're practical. They let the system continue without forcing it to change. To see why, it helps to zoom out, but not too far. Not plagues, not ancient times. Think ordinary agrarian life, early industrial worlds. Places close to subsistence. Margins were thin. Planning was a luxury. In these worlds, children weren't mainly emotional investments. They were economic ones, not cynically, literally. More children meant more hands. More hands meant better odds that someone would survive long enough to support the rest. That's uncomfortable to hear. It clashes with the modern image of childhood as fragile and sacred, but that image needs conditions that didn't yet exist. Surplus, stability, time to imagine something different. The kind of safety we expect now depends on delayed usefulness. Adults carrying cost without immediate return. Systems that can absorb loss without collapsing. None of that was guaranteed, so cultures optimized for continuity. Children learned early because there was no waiting room called preparation. They adapted because adaptation was cheaper than protection. They were exposed because exposure built competence faster than insulation ever could. Here's the quiet irony. What we read as indifference was often understood as care. Teaching a child to move through danger felt safer than trying to remove the danger itself. Removing danger required coordination, resources, foresight across generations. Teaching endurance required none of that. Now the day that once felt ordinary should feel less neutral. The freedom looks thinner. The resilience looks practiced. The absence of supervision starts to resemble something else. Not trust, expectation. And expectations, once they settle in, are hard to question, especially when they seem to be working. To see why none of this felt cruel at the time, there's something subtle to notice. Childhood didn't yet exist as a separate social category. There were children, of course, smaller bodies, younger people, but there was no shared belief that they needed a different moral structure. The child's day blended into adult life because there was nowhere else for it to go. Work wasn't hidden. Illness wasn't shut behind doors. Death wasn't abstract. Children learned how life worked by standing inside it, often in the way. Looking back, this creates a misunderstanding. We assume danger means negligence. But in systems where danger is unavoidable, negligence means something else. It doesn't mean exposure. It means inefficiency. A child who couldn't contribute by a certain age wasn't failing emotionally. They were failing structurally. And structure mattered more than sentiment because structure kept people fed. Education followed the same logic. When it existed, it wasn't protected. It was layered on top of labor. Learning happened with the same hands used for work. Skills came through repetition, through correction, not explanation. Mistakes were expensive, which made them stick. This produced competence early, but it came at a cost that rarely gets counted. The child learned how to survive the system long before anyone asked whether the system itself deserved survival. It's tempting to call this ignorance. To say people didn't know better, that explanation is comfortable and incomplete. Knowledge wasn't missing. Incentives were. Safety requires someone to absorb risk so someone else doesn't have to. In these worlds, there was no outside system to do that. Families were closed circuits. Risk stayed inside. Reduce risk for the child, and you increase it for the household. Delay usefulness, and you stretch the margin that keeps everyone alive. These aren't moral calculations. They're arithmetic. This is where the modern story starts to fracture. We like to think progress arrived because people suddenly cared more, but care was always there. What changed was the math. As productivity slowly increased, through tools, through trade, through machines, the system loosened. Not enough to be kind, just enough to experiment. A child could be less immediately useful without everything collapsing. That shift mattered more than any philosophy about innocence. Because once a system can tolerate delay, it can imagine protection. And once protection is imaginable, its absence starts to look like a choice. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no meeting, no moment where adults agreed that childhood should be safer, no moral breakthrough, no collective decision. What changed was simpler. The system gained slack. Slack is quiet, uncelebrated. It doesn't inspire movements. It doesn't give speeches. It just allows mistakes without immediate collapse. And once a society has slack, it starts noticing things it used to ignore. Factories didn't make childhood safer at first. They made it visible. Children working long hours in tight spaces left records behind. Injuries counted, absences logged, output measured. Harm, once spread out and vague, became legible. This is where the story often bends. Reform is remembered as compassion defeating cruelty. In reality, it was inefficiency being corrected. Injured children didn't become reliable workers. Sick children disrupted production. Untrained bodies caused accidents that slowed everyone down. Protection appeared first as optimization. Shorter hours meant fewer mistakes. Age limits improved consistency. Schooling standardized skills. None of this was about innocence. It was about stabilizing systems that had grown too complex to run on improvisation. The language changed later. Once children were removed from danger, their absence created contrast. A child no longer exposed looked different, softer, slower, less hardened. That difference invited meaning. The protected child began to seem naturally delicate, not carefully shielded. This is how protection rewrites the past. An intervention turns into a trait. Fragility looks inherent, not conditional. At the policy level, this mattered. Laws no longer sounded economic. They sounded moral. Education stopped being a tool. It became a duty. Safety stopped being optional. It became expected. But the old logic didn't vanish. It stepped back, changed language. Risk wasn't erased. It was relocated, moved into supply chains, institutions, future consequences. By the time a child's day looked familiar to modern eyes, scheduled, supervised, insulated, it felt obvious, natural, as if it had always been this way, which leads to the final, uncomfortable realization. What we call a normal child's day isn't the result of timeless wisdom. It's the temporary outcome of a system that can currently afford it. And systems that can afford things can also stop affording them. By the time childhood became safe, it had also become expensive. That part is rarely said out loud, but it explains what came next. A protected child costs things, time, resources, attention, delayed return. They're educated, not deployed, supervised, not trusted, shielded, not adapted. None of that is free. It only works when the system produces more than it immediately needs. That's why safety arrived unevenly. It appeared first where surplus was steady. It lagged where margins stayed thin. The idea spread faster than the conditions behind it. Expectations rose. Capacity didn't always follow. History knows this pattern. Whenever protections grow out of abundance, they feel permanent. They become identity. They stop feeling conditional. People forget what they replaced. Childhood safety, in this sense, isn't a moral finish line. It's a structural phase. The earlier world didn't disappear because it was corrected. It disappeared because it stopped being efficient under new constraints. And efficiency, not kindness, has always been the steadier engine of change. This is where the story closes its loop. The old child's day wasn't shaped by cruelty or ignorance. It was shaped by systems that couldn't afford delay. The modern child's day is shaped by systems that can, for now. The unsettling part isn't what changed. It's how reversible the logic is. When resources tighten, supervision becomes selective. When institutions strain, responsibility slides back to families. When delay grows costly, usefulness regains value. Not as belief, as arithmetic. History doesn't need villains to repeat itself. It just needs incentives to realign. So the old day, the unsupervised morning, the incidental labor, the early competence was never erased. It was paused, archived under conditions that made it unnecessary. That's why looking back feels uncomfortable. Not because the past was uniquely harsh, but because it made sense on its own terms. And consistency, once restored, rarely asks permission. The child wakes early again. The house is already loud. The day does not wait. This time, we recognize it. But recognition has never been the same as prevention.